Hello. Oh, wait, my cool greeting. Okay. Ahoy, mateys. I like that. Came up with that all myself. Anyway, hey guys. I hope you're all doing well. If you're on track with us, today is Tuesday, April 28th, and it is day 10 of my Survival, A Girl on Schindler's List. I hope you guys are liking this book so far. I've heard some good feedback about it. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. It's not everyone's perfect book or kind of book that they like, but I hope some of you are enjoying it and you're at least learning a little bit of information from it about some of our history, and that's really important. Okay, so today is day 10. It's Tuesday, April 28th-ish, or maybe not. That's okay. And we're going to read Chapter 9, Living in a Nightmare. So our standard skill that we're going to focus on today is RI 4.5. I can identify the structure of information presented in informational text. If you're thinking, we already did this with this book, you're right, we did. This week we're going to go back and circle back around to some of those previous standards that we touched on, and we're going to touch on them harder. We're going to master them. We're going to just keep practicing with those standards that are what we call the highly tested standards on LEAP. Okay? And they're also the foundational standards. All right, so mirrors on. I can identify the structure of information presented in an informational text. Mirrors off. Okay, so what does it mean to identify something? If we're identifying the structure, what does that mean? How do you identify something? It just means to find, right? Or to tell, or to discover, kind of, right? If we're going to identify something, it just means we're going to find it. Structure, what does that mean? Structure is going to be the organization of that information, right? How it's built, how a text is built. And when we talk about information that's presented in a text, what does that mean? Information that's just included in a text, right? So we're going to look again at text structure. We know for the most part that this book is a historical text, right? And we know that for the most part it is structured in sequence, right? When we have a historical text, it's going to be weird for it to be structured any other way. But there are different pieces of it, right? We can tell the structure of a text as a whole, and then we can also tell the structure of the pieces of a text. And this text happens to be organized into chapters, which is pretty rare for an informational text. So we can look at the structure of each chapter and the structure of the information presented in it, and we can describe that. Make sense? All right. So text structure, we have those 5 main ways that an informational text can be structured. We have description, where something is given and then many details about that thing are described. We have sequence, that's told in an order. Compare and contrast, when we tell about 2 things and how they're alike and different. Cause and effect, when we tell about the cause and the effect, which we talked about yesterday in terms of making connections. We talked about causes and effects. And then we have problem and solution, when a problem is given and one or multiple solutions are given to help fix that problem. Yeah? So we have to think about how the details in a text are organized, and we have to think about the relationship between the paragraphs, or the chapters in this case, and the ideas that are presented. Remember, text structure is very similar to making connections, but in the structure, you're really talking about the overall, the bigger picture of it. And when you talk about connections, you're talking about 2 details and how they're connected. Okay? All right. In Chapter 9, we're going to meet someone new, and that is Oskar Schindler's wife. So we're going to meet her and see how she fits into this story. When we left off, Rena had been taken to Auschwitz, a very, very dangerous concentration camp. And so in this chapter, well, I'll let you see. We have a couple more pictures of Auschwitz over here. This is kind of where the prisoners were taken into on the transport or the train. And then down here we have, this is a picture of the ruins of Oskar Schindler's factory. So remember, Oskar Schindler was on this very extensive mission to move his factory from Krakow over towards near Plossuf, the concentration camp. Okay. And that Plossuf was now being liquidated itself, and prisoners were being sent elsewhere. So Oskar Schindler was trying to figure out a way to keep his factory up and running while that concentration camp was no longer up and running, because, and the whole reasoning for all of this is that those Jews were being moved because the Nazis started to get concerned because they knew that they were losing the war. So they knew that they were about to get in trouble for these crimes that they had committed, and they were trying to avoid that. Make sense? Okay, so chapter 9 is broken up into a few different parts. Try to identify the structure of each part of the chapter. So I'm not sure what you guys see if you're reading online digitally, but for me, I see, and I have the answers in here, so I don't want to show you, but I see these little breaks as we read, right? So we're going to talk about the first 5 parts of that, because they each have not a different structure, but they each have, there are lots of structures within there, okay? So I gave you up here the first word and the last word of each part. So I'll try to stop reading and remind you, okay, so that was part 1. Okay, so this is part 2, just so that you remember. So we're going to look at those first 5 parts and try to identify the structure, how that information was organized in there. Okay. And lastly, our quote that we're going to kind of let reminisce in our mind today is not a good Nazi, but a good person. And we'll talk about what that means. Okay. All right. So let's read. I don't know where to put my video when I talk to y'all because I want you to see that. I'll just put it right here. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, let's read. All right, chapter 9, Living in a Nightmare. Words have not been invented to describe Auschwitz. Being there meant starving, getting sicker every day, and seeing things your eyes had trouble believing. Let me try to describe something of this horrible place. Of the more than 40,000 camps built by the Nazis, Auschwitz was not only the largest concentration camp, but also the largest killing center. Auschwitz, which was divided into 3 main camps, was located approximately 41 miles west of Krakow, where I was born. There was the main camp, called Auschwitz I. 2 miles from the main camp was Auschwitz-Birkenau, also called Auschwitz II, where deportation trains rolled in day and night. And there was Auschwitz-Monowitz, also known as Auschwitz III, where prisoners worked in factories day and night. During 6 years of operation, between 1.1 and 1.3 million people were murdered in Auschwitz. Jews, Sinti, and Roma people, once called gypsies, Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners, and other people labeled by the Nazis as anti-socials. 9 out of every 10 people murdered in Auschwitz were Jews. Okay, so that was part 1. Think about the structure of that information that was just presented to us. How was that information structured? One morning, 2 officers took me and another girl out of the roll call line and marched us to a clinic some distance away. Inside the clinic, a nurse had us lie on beds with white sheets. "Don't be afraid," she told us. "After this, you will be brought back to your barack." She inserted a needle into our arms, drew blood, and told us something strange. The blood will be used to save wounded German soldiers, she said. Can you imagine? The Germans made up lies about Jews being less than human, but it seemed our blood was good enough to save their soldiers. When she was finished taking our blood, the nurse handed us each a piece of white bread with a slice of liverwurst on it. It was the best food we had seen in a long time, and I was hungry, but I only took a bite and saved the rest for my mother. When guards brought us back to our barack, I told my mother what had happened. She insisted I eat the rest of the bread and liverwurst myself. Okay, that was part 2. Think about the organization of that information. How was that presented to us? What was the structure of that part? We worked all day, digging ditches, carrying supplies, and doing whatever the Germans told us to do. Sometimes at night, guards marched me and some other girls to the kitchen. They put wooden poles across our shoulders, and at both ends of the pole they hung heavy buckets of smelly soup made with potato peels and sawdust. So the soup was made with sawdust. Sawdust is like if you're working with wood and all of that like dust comes from it, that's sawdust. So they were putting like wood shavings into the soup that they were feeding the Jews. They pushed us out the door and forced us to carry the buckets down muddy roads to the barracks, where prisoners stood in line to receive a little bit of the rotten soup. For many, it was their only meal of the day. My image of the German people before the war was that they were just like people everywhere. Teachers, bus drivers, plumbers, electricians, normal people, fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters. Maybe many of them didn't like Jews, but they were still human, and we were all part of the same human race. Auschwitz destroyed that image. People who previously were respectable, law-abiding citizens became murderers and took part in the massacre of hundreds, thousands, and then millions of human beings, solely because they were Jews. How could that happen? How great is our responsibility to make sure it never happens again? So that was part 3. Think about that, how that information was structured, how it was presented to us. When Oscar learned that we, his women workers, had been sent to Auschwitz, he was furious. We were never supposed to be sent there. It appeared that a clerical error was about to erase all his efforts to keep us alive. To secure our release, he negotiated by phone with Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Hess. Then Oscar sent his secretary to meet Hess in person. These women are experts at their jobs, the secretary explained to Hess. They are highly trained and irreplaceable. I'm sure we can come to an agreement to have them sent back to the factory. The secretary then put a bag of precious diamonds on the table. Hess pocketed the diamonds and signed a sheet of paper giving permission for the Schindler Jews to be shipped out. Oscar had again saved us from destruction. The secretary handed the commandant a list of all of the women who should be sent to the Amalia factory in Czechoslovakia, and within hours we were marched to the railway station and once more pushed into cattle cars. The guards shut the big wooden doors, and the train departed. We had been in Auschwitz only 3.5 weeks, but it was long enough that most of us were sick and starving. One of the girls in the cattle car was burning from a high fever. She lay her head in my lap. I put my fingers through a hole in the side of the boxcar, grabbed a few snowflakes, and rubbed them on her lips. Hold on 1 second, guys. Okay, sorry guys. Okay. Hours later, the train stopped and the doors opened. We were in Brunlitz, Czechoslovakia. There on the platform stood Oscar, wearing his fancy green Tyrolean hat. We were so weak and embarrassed, we just sat there staring at him, amazed to still be alive. We smelled terrible, had lice in our hair and clothes, and looked like skeletons. Yet he seemed happy to see us. "Well," he said with a smile, "here you are. There's hot soup ready for you. Your men are already here, your fathers, husbands, and brothers. I will take care of you. You have nothing to worry about." We looked at one another in disbelief. It was a miracle. Hunger and the horrors of Auschwitz had made us weak. We climbed down from the cattle car as best we could and slowly walked the short distance from the train station to the factory. It was not as big or impressive as the factory Oscar had owned in Poissy, but it looked like a heaven to us, a place where we would be fed and sheltered. Oscar brought us to a building, and we climbed the stairs to the workers' living quarters on the second floor. A wall running through the middle of the large room created separate spaces for men and women. It was here that Mother and I were reunited with my grandfather. At 75 years of age, he was the oldest person to have made it onto the Schindler's List, and the oldest person working in the Brunlitz factory. "I know you went through hell to get here," Oscar told us. "That is in the past now. We have doctors who will show you where to wash and who will take care of those of you who are sick." In the basement of the factory, Oscar's wife, Emily, had built a clinic for sick and wounded workers. She instructed the doctors, who came from the prisoner population, to bathe us and rub disinfectant powder over us to get rid of the lice. This was important because lice carried deadly diseases, such as typhus. After 3 days in the clinic, we were free of the lice. Often I've thought back on those days and marveled at how Mrs. Schindler was like her husband. Not a good Nazi, but a good person. By using his influence and wealth, Oscar rescued nearly 1,200 Jewish men and women. These were people who, thanks to him, escaped the fate of the other 25,000 men, women, and children of Poissy, who were sent to their deaths in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and other death camps. He performed this miracle just in time. One day more in Auschwitz, and we too would have been killed. These days when I speak with, that was the end of part 4. So think about the structure there. These days when I speak with students, someone will ask me, "Why didn't you try to escape?" It's a good question. But how could Jews, during the Holocaust, escape when there were machine guns pointed at them and patrol dogs ready to pounce? Besides, there was no place to escape to. All around the camps were non-Jews who hated us and who were cooperating with the Nazis to murder us all. Some people did try to escape, young people in particular who had the strength to run away. A handful succeeded. But if any of the non-Jews living near the camp saw them, they called the police. The police hunted them down and shot them on the spot. For those of us so fortunate to work for Oscar, we never thought about running away. I will give you another example of how well he cared for us. Oscar and Emily owned a villa located close to their Brunlitz factory, but Oscar knew we were terrified the Germans would arrest us during the night and send us to our deaths. To calm our fears, he never slept in his beautiful villa. Instead, he slept in a small office on the ground floor of his factory, keeping watch over us. For 9 months, up to the day we were liberated by the Russians, my mother and I led a sheltered and protected life under his care. Emily deserves just as much appreciation as her husband. If any of us were sick, she took care of us. She went to the nearby village to look for extra food and find farina cereal to cook for younger ones like me. She outfitted the clinic with medical equipment purchased on the black market. Some of the prisoners were already dying when we arrived at the Brunlitz factory. One was an older woman who succumbed to a heart attack. The other was a young girl who died of cancer. Oscar and Emily arranged for them to receive a proper Jewish burial in a secret graveyard behind the factory. They even noted the spot where these women were buried, so that after the war, their bodies could be found and relocated to a Jewish cemetery. Such kindness toward Jews was illegal under German law, but the Schindlers didn't care. We knew how lucky we were. For every Jew saved by Oscar and Emily, there were tens of thousands who did not survive. Okay, that was the last part that we're going to pay close attention to the structure. That was part 5. So think about how that information was presented to us in that part. One cold day toward the end of January 1945, Oscar and Emily learned that a train carrying prisoners had stopped at a nearby station. The boxcars were rumored to be filled with Jewish slave laborers from a factory named Golischow, a subcamp of Auschwitz. When the Russian army approached from the east, the Germans closed down the Golischow factory and transported the Jewish laborers by train to a smaller camp in Czechoslovakia. But the train was delayed for more than a week, and all the while, 96 Jewish prisoners were locked in freezing boxcars without food or water. Years later, Emily explained what happened next. The locks on the boxcar doors had frozen shut. When the locks were cut and the doors opened, the scene was a nightmare almost beyond imagination, Emily wrote in her memoir. 13 of the prisoners in the boxcar had died, but the others were still breathing. The Schindlers brought all the prisoners still alive to their clinic, and Emily worked around the clock to try to save them. In the morning, she went to the train station with suitcases full of vodka. When the trains arrived, she traded the vodka for as many medical supplies as she could get from train passengers, then brought the supplies back to the clinic. Next to the Schindler's factory was a grain mill run by a family named Dalbeck. Emily went to see Mrs. Dalbeck and explained that the grain from the mill was desperately needed. "I want to see that our Jewish workers don't starve to death," Emily explained. Mrs. Dalbeck agreed to help, and Emily returned to the factory with sacks of grains and semolina flour. In the clinic, she carefully fed her patients from the Golischow train. After not eating for so long, they could only digest 1 spoonful of porridge at a time. Eventually, thanks to her care, most of them regained their health. Those of us who survived the Holocaust as Schindler Jews remember Mrs. Schindler with as much gratitude as we do her husband, Oscar. Meanwhile, Oscar continued to spend all his money buying food to keep us alive. He also had to feed more than 100 German officers who were assigned to guard his factory. To keep the officers friendly, he gave them expensive alcohol and cigarettes. All of us working in his factory wondered the same thing. How much longer would his money last? And what would happen to us when it ran out? Okay, so we have a couple of different structures that were in there that we can pay attention to. But I also want you to think about, so what were some of the things that Oscar and Emily did to help protect the Jews who worked for them, and why do you think that they did it? And then I want you to think about that quote that we have that we're focusing on today. Not a good Nazi, but a good person. Why is that important? And why do you think the author told that to us? All right, guys, chapter 9 done. I'll see you for chapter 10 soon. Love you, miss you, and mean it.